It's now been a year, give or take, since ChatGPT was released into the wild. And in that 365 or so days, there's been a lot of both exuberance and hand-wringing about how generative AI tools might change work as we know it.
Work and almost everything else, including the relationship between government and the public it serves. What we saw coming and what we didn't. It's the year in review and the top stories in GovTech with the writers and editors of Government Technology.
TFIC takes you deeper into the stories that are shaping the future of state and local government.
Oh, X.
Yeah?
You will be the letter of the day?
Oh, you bet I will.
Final frontier. To boldly go where no man has gone before.
You're not Buzz Lightyear.
I'm Siri.
And I'm Google.
And I am Alexa.
Alexa seems so smart. I think we'd have a lot to talk about.
Pew, pew.
From Government Technology and Governing, this is a special cover story episode of The Future in Context. I'm Paul Taylor.
And I'm Ashley Silver.
I hold in my ink-stained hands a copy of the December issue of Government Technology magazine. It is the annual Year in Review issue. It provides a look back at the biggest stories in GovTech for 2023, including everything from advances in urban transit and micromobility to retrofitting old, tired systems that do the heavy lifting of government.
Plus, a look at the ever-evolving cybersecurity threat landscape and important progress on the digital equity front.
And let's not forget the X factor.
We invited some of the writers and editors to drill down on these stories and their beats. Joining us is managing editor Lauren Kincaid, associate editor Zach Quaintance, and senior writers Jewel Pattison-Gordon and Skip Deskind.
So, Skip, people were on the move in their cities in all kinds of interesting ways this last year. Tell us about it.
So I think, one of the things I think that stands out for me is the way electrification is working its way into transportation, whether it's electric cars or electric bikes. I think that was a big story this year. California is always sort of a leader in this area. The latest statistics shows that new car sales in California this last quarter were 27% electric. That's definitely a trend. Transit is still struggling though from its sort of COVID slump, and that continues to be an issue. And what's interesting too about that is that it's kind of a big city issue. Small transit agencies have pretty much rebounded from the COVID decline, whereas the big agencies, the New York, Bay Area, Chicago, are having a much harder time regaining their ridership. And I think that's largely that's a function of changing commuter patterns. For decades, those systems were built around shuttling office workers to and from their downtown, and that's changed, and so that's the way it is. So that's kind of some of the bigger sort of things I've seen.
Let's touch on micromobility for a second. There seems to have been a shakeout in e-scooters and kind of the rise of the e-bike this last year. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. I was at the Micromobility America conference a few weeks ago, and if you would have been to this conference like in 2009, it was all, e-scooters. They were everywhere. They were buzzing all over the place. Fast forward to today, and it's all e-bikes. You didn't even see an e-scooter. Not that e-scooters are going away by any means, but I think ridership on those devices is down. I mean, that's real. And riders or urbanites or whoever tends to prefer the e-bike. I think probably it feels safer, I would think. But nonetheless, you can go farther on it too, because they go a little faster. But nonetheless, there's a lot of new technology in the e-bike space, particularly in areas like e-cargo bikes and those kinds of devices. So, that's another interesting piece there with transportation. If that micromobility is going strong in all these different cities, Is that putting a lag on transit's recovery? Good question. I don't know. We haven't seen any hard data around that, but I think it's worth some looking into.
And as you look 12 to 18 months into the future, what are you seeing? And does the city-owned curb matter now more than it used to?
I think we're going to see more cities look into curb management, real actual digital curb management strategies. I think you're going to see more efforts around, and again, that's sort of part and parcel, pun intended, with the whole delivery world. More and more technologies and entrepreneurship sprouting up around deliveries and right sizing the vehicle for the package. There's a drone delivery company that's starting up in the Dallas Fort Worth area right now. So you're seeing all of these different sort of areas get some energy.
Okay, so Joel, it's always interesting to learn just how cybersecurity efforts evolve each year with new threats always looming. And I know you've been pretty busy keeping up with it all. So what was your story for the year pertaining to cybersecurity? What really stuck out to you, and what's its connection to state and local government?
I think one thing that's, really an interesting and something worth talking about is Move It, right? This is had a global effect. We keep hearing, we recently heard Maine was hit. It's hit state governments. It's hit federal agencies. And I think it shows some of the ways that cyber attacks are evolving. And this was the group CLOP exploited a 0-day vulnerability in a secure file transfer service. And some of the implications is we're seeing cyber extortion not always actually be strictly ransomware. It's not always using malware anymore. And some of that may actually be due to some good practices, and people are improving backup strategies, which means that the traditional single extortion, where the ransomware group encrypts your files and demands money to decrypt it, isn't always as effective. So we're seeing both a rise of double extortion, where they encrypt your files, demand money to decrypt it, and demand money not to publish it, and what CLOP did, where they're exfiltrating your data and demanding money not to publish it. And that can be particularly damaging to groups like government, where they have a lot of sensitive information. It also may be easier for some groups to do this kind of attack. It's a little bit faster. There's the unfortunate element too that what got hit was a service for securely transferring files. So, organizations using it maybe really trying to do the right thing, and that I think unfortunately points to the two aspects of there's no full security in cyber. You, as much as you're planning to not get hit, you also have to have plans around how to mitigate it and how to try to limit effects when you are hit. And also, some people say it sort of points to this idea of they need to really carefully look at your vendors and understand what they're doing. And on the federal level, there's, a push to that because it's an understanding that local governments, regular people can only do so much to stay secure. And we need people who are making software to also really make it secure by default.
As far as cyber extortion payments, because you mentioned that, right? I think it's been a bit of an enigma on how to handle that. I know there's been some talk about actually banning cyber extortion payments because it could potentially add that heavy monetary load on government agency as far as payment. And then on the other hand, that data is being held if these aren't paid. So I know you've spoken to a lot of Cisco's throughout the year, really, about that. Could you kind of touch on that and how you think that's leaning, or that kind of internal debate that's going on right now?
Yeah, it's an unfortunately tough situation. There's this recognition that if you pay, it makes it a worthwhile crime when the perpetrators can get money out of it, right? But it's also really hard for some organizations not to pay, and there's a fear, right, that if we had a blanket national ban, that hackers would likely try to test commitment to it by going after the folks that really are the least prepared to withstand it, which so that gets cited as small businesses that really, if they're not having revenue coming in, might close, or those who provide essential services, government hospitals, where really well-being is at risk if they're not operational. A couple years back, IST's ransomware task force put out a report kind of looking at what's the ecosystem around ransomware, what's the drivers of it, and they sort of talked a little bit about this issue too. The ultimate goal is being, let's get to a point where at least very few payments happen, but how do we get there in a measured way? And some of that's how do you find supports for these organizations that maybe have this intense pressure? We actually saw a recent development on the international stage, where there's the International Counter Ransomware Initiative is about 50 national members right now, and they agreed to like a joint pledge that said basically relevant institutions under their authority should not pay ransomware. It's fairly limited. I think there's a belief in the US that it would not include state or local or private sector, but it's a nod towards trying to find ways to reduce that flow, and certainly putting other efforts to disrupt the mechanism by which they're getting money and how they're laundering it is another way of going at the problem too, and trying to prevent, at least if payment does happen, preventing it from reaching the perpetrators.
And what do you believe will be a central focus next year in the cybersecurity arena? Because, if we're looking at causation or, is it a lack of training? Is it a lack of internal security procedures? Is it just that generative AI and other social engineering scams are outpacing security measures at this time? What do you think will be the central focus as far as prevention in the cybersecurity arena?
I think there's a lot of different things there. I mean, one thing that does keep getting hammered is some of the basics, which is just making sure people are doing things like multi-factor authentication. I think zero trust security is still a goal that we're trying to move towards. I think we are seeing some good efforts around collaboration. The state and local cybersecurity grant program, the way the grant works is most of the money has to go to local governments, and it's required state and local governments to come together in planning committees that have members across a lot of stakeholders. And so some folks say more than the financial money, what's been helpful is bringing everyone to the table. And we're seeing some interest in things like shared services that can kind of stretch that further. Disinformation is definitely a concern, and certainly scams are getting more realistic with the use of, voice spoofing. And so there's definitely a lot of different tools out there, but I do think also pushing on some of the general best practices, like being quick around patching, because as much as we hear about things like 0 days, there's also vulnerabilities that have been out there for a while that do emerge too. And I think on the state and local government picture, though, certainly funding continues to be a concern.
So, Lauren, let's bring you into the conversation. Government is disproportionately still reliant on big iron, the legacy systems that are in the back office. Lack a certain sexy factor, but they do the heavy lifting in government. Where are we circa the end of 2023 in terms of modernization efforts?
It's interesting. These big systems modernizations, these legacy systems that ERP, Health and Human Services, these the DMV, these big things that we all interact with every day. They're kind of that foundation of government. They're not the fun things to read about. They're not the fun things to write about necessarily, but they're so important. They underpin everything we do. And so this year, it was interesting. We looked at our March issue of 2023 at 18 different states who were working on different facets of these big modernizations and where they were. And I think what stood out among all of them is they were all kind of seeking to, yes, update, better security, better just usability for the government side, but also to ultimately deliver better resident services. I think that was really what came to the top for me and in revisiting a lot of that. So, while it doesn't seem like updating the financial systems for the state of Connecticut would have a great, impact on citizens, it would ultimately, it has that domino effect of, if it's easier for the state to do its own work, then the residents can benefit from those better services down the line.
Is there an upside for 2024?
I think just those continued, these are long contracts. These are long projects. These, you don't decide to overhaul the DMV in March and roll it out in July. So I think we'll start to see a lot of these things come to fruition, like seeing these, actually the systems roll out, the improvements happen. And, more states are working on all those things all the time. It's that background stuff. It doesn't get the catchy headlines, doesn't get the breaking news, traffic on our site, but it's going to keep happening. It's going to keep, and that whole resident experience is, I think, going to continue to just be at the core of what all these agencies are doing. And I say at the state level, that is largely what we covered. But of course, this is happening all over the country, at all levels of government, just on different scales.
Pity the CIO or CTO who gets his first or her first look at an inventory of systems after taking the job and realizing that there's a lot of trouble there on the raised floor data center.
Zach, as far as workforce, we know that nothing moves in government without the enhancement of employee skill sets, training, and the right collaborative partnerships, particularly with new tech advancements emerging year after year. So what were the standout points for you this year as far as workforce and tech and state and local government?
Two things were true this year, one of which is true every year, which is that workforce is both a priority and a problem for government. It's hard to hire for tech roles because, like you pointed out, it's always changing. And there's also been and continues to be more and more retirements, just making finding new ways to bring people into government tech roles a constant priority in both the state and local spaces. In terms of standout projects this past year, I wrote about the state of Indiana's State Earn and Learn program, or SEAL, as it neatly abbreviates to. They're reskilling a new workforce for GovTech roles. So they're taking folks who've worked in restaurants, factories. They even had a gentleman who was repairing arcade games at Dave & Buster's. And as they're learning to do cybersecurity or systems or IT jobs, they're getting paid for it. They're working for the state. And that has a few benefits. It makes it easier for people to take that plunge and sort of switch careers logistically, because they're not having to leave the workforce or go to school at night while working full time. They're actually working for the state. And it really enhances the buy-in they ultimately have when they go to work for the state. I talked to maybe half a dozen folks who've gone through this, and it wasn't uncommon for them to get emotional when they were talking about the opportunity that the state had provided them and say how it changed their life, and they didn't think they'd ever see themselves in this sort of job when they'd been working as a restaurant manager or a line cook for a decade. And I think that program in Indiana is one that will continue to mature and improve. They have an incredible retention rate. I think something like 90%. It's been used to hire 46 people in the state IT government. I imagine a lot of other states are calling Indiana, asking questions about this.
Since they are tapping into successfully this untapped potential in Indiana, I know you've also covered stories for Texas and Colorado where they're kind of following that same theme. So I was wondering if you thought that in the years to come that this would be something that would be expanded and kind of this would serve as a foundation for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, something this successful, aimed at such a universal problem that it is something that both states and cities deal with. Yeah, I'd imagine it would be expanded, and it's not the only. This sort of reskilling on the job is not the only way that government organizations are addressing these challenges. There's kind of a lot of smaller methods to do so that we've already seen spread to most government agencies. I mean, I haven't quantified it, but things like rewording job postings to be a little more accessible, changing job requirements so that tech positions have traditionally required 4-year degrees. Even if you know how to do the job, you're seeing some government agencies kind of start the process of changing that so that it's more skills-based rather than degree-based and things like that. So yeah, I think with the demand for workers sort of always being there, yeah, we'll definitely see it spreading to many other states and cities.
Lauren, let's bring you back. Public agencies have spent a lot of time building significant followings on social media platforms. Then the earth moved this last year when Twitter was purchased, and not only the name changed. Public agencies are now faced with really an existential question: should they stay or should they go? Is X why government can't have good things?
The rebrand of Twitter to X is really the big story of the year, right? I mean, that was a huge shift for government, for business, for individuals using this service, and continues to be, right? You know, every week there's some headlines somewhere about what X did, what Elon Musk did, how we should be responding to this platform, whether we're leaving this platform, are we going to Mastodon, are we going to Threads, are we going to this and that? So yeah, government is definitely part of that equation. You know, we talk to people throughout the year who are kind of experts in this or just work in social, and what they said, one of the problems is, you know, they've built like you said, they've built these significant followings, and you don't carry those with you. I believe you, Paul, called it the problem of portability in a piece you wrote for the magazine, and that's a real issue. And because, you know, social, it's kind of for fun and it's for advertising, but for government, a lot of it is about getting critical information to people, especially in times of emergency. And so if this is, you know, the platform people are going to find out if it's time to evacuate in case of a wildfire or a flood, you need to be able to have that updated information. And some of these changes from X, you know, in terms of who can have a certified government site, have made it hard for people to access that information. So, and of course, have also led to fake accounts. People spoofing government accounts has become much easier since this switch to X, which in turn causes other problems. So a lot of it's still up in the air. You know, how government should handle this. A lot of people I've read are saying, no, we're staying on, you know, X, Twitter, as long as we can, because that's where our people are. But they're also looking into other channels to get some of that information out. And just because, you know, it comes down to how do we communicate with the public, with our people, and get them the information they need.
So, Zach, you've covered a lot of very interesting digital equity topics this year, with your What's New in Digital Equity weekly article series being a recurring thing. So give us an overview of the advancements you've seen this year towards expanding broadband services, overall digital connectivity, and digital literacy.
Yeah, I mean, this was a banner year for digital equity and broadband work in this country. We're sort of undergoing something similar to getting the entire country connected to electricity. Like, that's what's happening right now with broadband. A lot of it's supported by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. That money is slowly making its way to states, and part of what we saw this year is all 50 states submitting proposals to qualify for that money. And, you know, as we speak right now, the details of those plans are slowly rolling out. The goal is to get every person in the country connected to high-speed internet that they can afford long term. But that's only part of it. There's another sort of parallel work campaign that needs to be done, and that's sort of the digital equity piece, which is getting everyone devices to connect to that internet, as well as training them in the skills they need to use the internet in meaningful ways so that they can participate in a society that's increasingly online. So that's things like classes at senior centers and VFWs and libraries, largely led by something called the Digital Navigators program, which is sort of the lead model for that work, where it's a train the trainer program. It taps people who have relationships in communities who can do that last bit of sitting down with someone and teaching them how to create their own email address, how to apply for jobs, how to avoid scams. Like, there's a lot that needs to be done that's being done, like I said, with the funding from the federal government. A lot of this happened during the pandemic, but continues to sort of ripple outward, which is just the understanding that everyone should have access to this, and everyone should have these devices, and everyone should have this training. so that they can participate in business, education, and healthcare.
And as you said, there are various programs across the U.S., to build on this accessibility component. And I guess I just want to ask, what are the common threads that you've seen in those programs? Because they all have one central goal, basically to bring that connectivity, but then also bring awareness to the different programs that are out there to help them be able to afford internet or things of that nature. So what are the common threads to success that you're seeing within all of these programs?
There's a couple of them. One of them is almost geographic in nature. It's sort of reaching people where they live. That means approaching it neighborhood by neighborhood in cities, or traveling great distances in rural areas to make sure that people don't have to go far out of their way to reach these classes. And then another one is trust. I mean, that's really kind of at the heart of it as we get to these sort of last mile digital equity programs, is getting the understanding of how to use the internet and why you should want to use the internet to people through a trusted messenger, which takes a lot of different forms. But and it does vary sort of from community to community. What works in one community is not necessarily going to work in another, but like that idea of finding a trusted messenger to help with this work is sort of universal.
And moving ahead next year and in the years to come, what do you think will be the central focus as far as closing that digital divide and continuing the, journey to digital equity?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I was at the Net Inclusion Conference in February in San Antonio, and Angela Seifer, who's the executive director and founder of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, put it this way. She said, digital equity is having a moment. Like nobody can deny that. This is historic. It's never had so much buy-in. But what happens when that moment ends? And that's what we need to think about. So sustainability is a big piece. Like right now, it's almost fashionable and it's great PR to support digital equity for companies, for local government, all these organizations. But the nature of digital equity is the digital divide can never quite be entirely closed. There's always going to be new technology. There's always going to be new need for digital skills training. Like there'll come a point in all of our lives where we'll be on the other side of the digital divide just because technology will outpace us. And at that point, society needs to prioritize continued lifetime digital skills training for all of its members. So sort of future proofing is going to become, I mean, it's already a component, a lot of the requirements for how to spend this broadband money to make sure that it's effective, but it needs to stay at the forefront so that there continues to be buy-in when this moment of let's get everyone connected sort of passes and people move on to other causes.
This has been a useful discussion of the stories that had their moment in 2023. As a way of taking just another look forward at 2024 and perhaps beyond, what are your choices for underreported or sleeper stories from the last year that may well surface in the year ahead? I'm going to pick on you first, Jewel.
I can think of a couple things. Well, I don't know if this is underreported, but I think an interesting trend we're sort of seeing, and I think the Cyber Safety Review Board took a look at, is shifts a little bit in who's engaging in cybercrime. There's been a bit of attention on how young people can be engaged. There's been a couple of notable groups that, like Lapsus and Scattered Spider, and I think one of them had about 17 to 24-year-olds was seen as a lot of the members in it. And there's some discussion on why this might be. And in some cases, it could be that there may be less fear of prosecution if there's a little bit gentler treatment in the justice system for juveniles. And I'm sure it's in a sort of an accessible space, but there's been discussion of how do you divert kids from getting into something like this, and questions around if teens are getting into things like piracy or cyber stalking, if that's something like an entry point that maybe leads into more serious stuff. And on a side note, I had been talking with cyber.org, which is a group that does cybersecurity education and training efforts. And they were talking about very much when you're teaching K-12 about cyber, you also have to be teaching them ethics and sort of the warnings, because I guess on another note, there's an element too of cyber and digital being very much a part of everything. We had a story in Texas about education training for local police responding to things that may be cyber crimes, and how, digital evidence is very much something that's a part of a lot of all kinds of work. And so this was it's sort of a training effort to help people who are responding to a scene even know, should I turn off the computer? What do I need to document if this might be a cyber crime, and how to think around that? Because not all jurisdictions have a cyber unit, or maybe the cyber unit isn't the first person on the scene.
Skip, you got a sleeper?
I'm gonna sort of gravitate toward this sort of big issue of infrastructure, and how we're seeing the sort of these big infrastructure projects start to unfold. We really are starting to see it happen now. The big infrastructure law passed by Congress was 2 years ago. There's a lot of planning that happened, and then now we're starting to see those the shovels get in the ground and those projects take form. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see what it means. What does all of this infrastructure mean? Bringing all of this new sort of next gen transportation infrastructure and things like that. What will it mean for cities and states and for the people who use it? There's already been some interesting research, kind of looking at how where the money's going on a per capita basis, and if for the sort of more political minds out there that want to sort of parse the numbers, there's a lot of red states that are getting a lot of money per capita that were probably not always very supportive of the president's signature domestic policy. Anyway, following that money, seeing where it goes, seeing how those projects come to fruition, and what does it mean for communities. That's I think going to be an interesting piece to watch.
Zach, does a sleeper come to mind for you?
Yeah, something I noticed while reading through our recent digital city survey was that the increased emphasis on sort of a crossover between communications work and GovTech. I think that's a building story. It's always been in our space, but I'm seeing more and more of it. And it's sort of present in both of the issues I talked about with workforce and digital equity. Like, how do you get the word out to people about these reskilling programs? How do you get buy-in for your digital literacy programs? I just think the communications shop is lining up more and more with GovTech, and we'll see a lot. That's a developing story in our space for the next year.
And Lauren, final word belongs to you.
I don't know if it's a sleeper story, but one of the things, so this has clearly been the year of AI. We talk about it within everything we do, cyber, transportation, digital, it's everywhere. But one of the things that really struck me this year was at the NASCIO conference. And in May, we asked a question of the people we interviewed about generative AI. And it was interesting. Most of them responded about kind of traditional AI, more, non-generative AI. Like, we didn't fully grasp what it was. Your chat GPT and these other services. And when we asked a similar question at the annual conference in October, the annual NASCIO conference, everybody knew what we were talking about. Everybody understood chat GPT. Everybody understood how generative AI worked. And to see that shift that quickly was really, really interesting. So I'm excited. There's so many questions around all this technology and its ethics and its security and its whether we should even be doing it. But I'm interested to see in the next year how much more we progress if we could get that far with very smart people in 6 months, going from, I don't know what it is, it's a chatbot, to like, oh, this is what it is and this is how we're going to use it. So I think that'll be very interesting to watch.
Sure is a fluid environment, and fast moving is kind of a nice change of pace. Thank you all for doing this, being good sports. We'll look forward to seeing the issue in print, digital, and online at govtech.com. Ashley, 2023 was your first year with GT. What did it look like to you?
One thing that I do think is a common thread that I've seen throughout government agencies is really a willingness to evolve as new technologies expand to every corner of our world. And I think that that's really the most important thing.
I think that's exactly right. And it's a very fluid environment, very dynamic, sometimes very tumultuous, particularly where AI is concerned. But I also think that it bodes well for 2024 and beyond. This last year has been one of cleanup, of building defenses on cybersecurity, and modernization. Those investments of time, talent, and no small amount of fresh federal funding to improve service delivery and extend them to a wider universe of residents. I think it all adds up to the building out of operational efficiency, which we've been working on for a very long time, and continued civic innovation that you just outlined. All of this is available in the Year in Review issue of Government Technology, of course, available in print, online, and there's a digital issue too, all of which you can access at govtech.com.
We're diving into the evolutions in tech that could shape your world. Don't miss out. Listen and subscribe to TFIC for free on YouTube or the podcast app of your choice, Apple Podcast, Spotify, Odyssey, or Audible. And if you like what you hear, please leave us a 5-star review.